My name is Elias Thorne. I am a park ranger, specializing in resource management for the National Park Service, a position I have held for the better part of 2 decades. My official duties are varied, encompassing backcountry patrols, ecological surveys, and the inventory and protection of the natural and historical features contained within the vast tracts of wilderness entrusted to our care. It is a role I consider less a job and more a stewardship, a commitment to the profound, silent majesty of these ancient mountains. Many of my colleagues prefer the more populated park areas, the visitor centers and scenic drives where they can engage with the public. I am not one of them. My temperament is better suited to the deep solitude of the backcountry, to the long weeks spent alone in remote mountain posts where the only voices are the wind in the hemlocks and the rush of a cold stream. This preference for isolation is not misanthropy. It is a professional asset, a prerequisite for the kind of work that requires immense patience and a deep, abiding comfort with one's own company. There is a psychological resilience demanded by this life, a quiet strength that I have cultivated over many years of walking these trails alone, a reality echoed in the memoirs of rangers who have come before me. My current assignment was the culmination of this career path, a multi-week solo expedition into a rarely patrolled sector of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. This area, a labyrinth of steep gorges and high ridges, was once the heart of the Little River Lumber Company's aggressive logging operations in the early 20th century. Between 1901 and 1939, they carved through this wilderness, leaving scars that are only now beginning to heal. The land was absorbed into the park in the 1930s, but its remoteness has left it largely untouched by modern park infrastructure. My mission was twofold: to document the state of forest regeneration and to identify and catalog any remaining unmapped structures from the logging era. These relics, old cabins, forgotten equipment, decaying bridges, needed to be assessed as neither potential hazards to be removed or historical artifacts to be preserved. The first few days of the trek were arduous but familiar. I pushed deep into the park's green heart, following the faint indentations of old logging railroad grades, now little more than shallow ditches in the forest floor, almost entirely reclaimed by a century of leaf, fall, and root growth. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying wood. This was the Appalachian forest in its full, overwhelming glory, one of the most biologically diverse temperate regions on the planet. The landscape was a constant series of long, broad ridges, steep slopes, deep gorges, and wide intermountain valleys. A topography that has fostered an incredible array of life over millennia of geologic stability. The dominant canopy was a mix of oak, hickory, and ancient stands of eastern hemlock that had, by some miracle, escaped the logger's saw. The understory was a riot of endemic flora, a living museum of rare species: the delicate, drooping heads of American lily, of valley, the ghostly white of trailing monkshood, and the waxy leaves of galax carpeting the ground in dense colonies. Navigating this terrain was a constant battle. The old railbeds often disappeared into what the old timers called rhododendron hells. These were not the manicured shrubs of suburban gardens, but monstrous thickets of rhododendron maximum, some reaching heights of 20 feet or more. Their branches, thick as a man's arm, twisted together into an impenetrable lattice that blocked out the sun and deadened all sound. To get through them, I often had to abandon walking and resort to crawling on my hands and knees, my pack snagging on the gnarled wood. The world reduced to a claustrophobic, green, tinged twilight. It was in these hells that you could truly appreciate the wildness of this place. The feeling that you were an intruder in a world that had its own ancient, implacable rules. On the 5th day, after forcing my way through a particularly nasty slick that left my arms and face crisscrossed with scratches, I emerged onto the lip of a gorge wider and deeper than any I had yet encountered, and spanning it was a skeletal apparition that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was a bridge, a massive wooden railroad trestle, stretching at least 200 feet across the chasm, its dark form a stark, geometric scar against the verdant wilderness. It was not on any of my maps, modern or historical. Using my binoculars, I surveyed its construction with a ranger's eye for detail and decay. It was a classic timber trestle, a series of rigid A-frame supports called bents, marching across the gorge, each one a complex latticework of heavy posts and diagonal sway braces. The timbers were enormous, likely old growth oak or Douglas fir, hewn from the very giants that once stood on these slopes. They were blackened to the color of charcoal, preserved by a century of saturation with creosote. Even from a distance, I could almost smell the acrid, chemical tang of it, a scent that never truly leaves the wood. Heavy iron bolts and plates clamped the joints together, rusted but still holding fast. It was a monument to a brutal kind of ingenuity, built not for elegance, but to bear the crushing weight of the geared shay locomotives that once hauled fortunes in timber out of these mountains. The structure was a place of inherent conflict, a violent line of industrial ambition drawn across a landscape that measured time in millennia. It felt wrong, an unhealed wound. I made my way down to the approach. The ground here was soft and damp, a thick carpet of moss growing over the compacted earth where the tracks once lay. And that's when I saw them. Footprints. A single set, leading onto the bridge. The tread pattern was modern, a vibram sole or something similar, pressed clearly into the moss. My first thought was of a lost hiker, a Turon, who had wandered dangerously off trail. Though how they could have gotten this deep into a closed sector was a mystery in itself. I followed the prints with my eyes. They proceeded in a steady, confident line of steps out onto the wooden decking of the bridge. They passed the first bent, the second, the third. They continued toward the very center of the span, a point suspended more than 100 feet above the rock-strewn creek below. And then they stopped. I don't mean they scuffed, or turned, or stumbled. They simply ceased to exist. One moment there was a clear print of a right boot, the next, nothing but the weathered, gray wood of the bridge deck. It was as if the person who made them had been lifted straight up into the sky, vanishing without a trace. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the gorge pressing in on me. I scanned the chasm below, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. There was no body, no splash of color from a backpack or jacket, no broken branches on the steep, wooded slopes to mark a fall. The railings of the bridge, from what I could see, were weathered but intact. I looked back and forth along the decking. There was no second set of prints, no return journey. It was a physical impossibility. A scene without a story. A line drawn in the dirt that led directly to nowhere. And as a cold knot of unease tightened in my stomach, I had the distinct and unwelcome feeling that I had just stumbled upon a place where the normal rules of the world had been suspended. My training kicked in, overriding the primal alarm bells ringing in the back of my mind. A park ranger is, above all, a pragmatist. We are trained to observe, document, and analyze before we conclude. There had to be a logical explanation. A fall was the most obvious, despite the lack of evidence. I unslung my pack and took out my high-powered binoculars, scanning the gorge below with methodical precision. I traced the line from the last footprint down to the creek bed, 100 feet of empty air. Nothing. No snagged clothing on the rhododendron-choked slopes. No unnatural depression in the leaf litter. No splash of color from a discarded pack. The creek, shallow and clear, flowed over a bed of smooth, gray stones. There was no body. I turned my attention back to the bridge itself. Perhaps the person had climbed over the railing and shimmied along the outside of the structure, though to what end I couldn't imagine. I zoomed in on the massive creosote-soaked timbers of the bents. The wood was ancient and weathered, but the iron bolts holding the sway braces and posts together seemed solid, their rust a mere surface stain. There were no fresh scrape marks, no broken splinters, nothing to indicate a recent climb. The railings, simple thick beams, running the length of the span, were intact. There were no reports of missing persons in this sector. But this area was so remote. It could be weeks or months before anyone was noticed missing. I took out my camera and began documenting the scene. Just as procedure dictated, wide shots of the bridge and gorge, then detailed shots of the footprints, each one a perfect, muddy testament leading to its own negation. The professional in me was satisfied. I had my report, my evidence. I could turn back now, hike the 5 days to my station, and file a report that would baffle my superiors and likely get filed away as an unsolved anomaly. But the man in me, the one who had spent 20 years learning the rhythms and secrets of these mountains, couldn't let it go. It felt like a personal challenge, a riddle posed by the wilderness itself. The silence of the gorge was no longer peaceful. It was expectant. It was waiting for my next move. My decision was made before I was even fully conscious of it. I had to cross. Or at least, I had to walk to the point where the footprints vanished. I checked my pack, securing every strap and buckle. The thought of my own gear snagging on some rotten piece of wood was a persistent worry. I took a deep breath. The air tasting of damp, moss, and that faint, chemical tang of the creosote, and stepped onto the bridge. The timbers beneath my boots were solid, far more so than I'd expected. The railroad ties were spaced about a foot apart, with a decking of thick planks laid over them. The wood was silvered with age, but the preservative treatment had done its job, warding off a century of rot. Still, each step was a conscious, deliberate act. I kept my eyes fixed on the structure, testing my weight on each plank before committing. The gorge fell away on either side, a dizzying drop that I forced myself to ignore. The only sounds were the soft tread of my boots and the faint, rhythmic creak of the old wood, a sound like a deep, slow sigh. I followed the footprints. Left, right, left, right. A steady, even gait. Whoever this person was, they hadn't been hesitant. They had walked with a purpose. I passed the first massive A, frame bent, then the second. The wind picked up, whistling through the complex lattice of the trestle supports, creating a low, mournful hum. It was a lonely, desolate sound that seemed to amplify the profound isolation of the place. I was a single, small figure suspended between two sides of an ancient ravine, on a structure that had no business still being here. As I approached the center of the bridge, the point where the final right footprint was pressed into a patch of dried moss, a strange sensation began to creep over me. It started with the sound. The wind didn't die down, but the noise it made seemed to change, the humming deepening into a low frequency, thrum that I felt more in my bones than heard with my ears. It was like standing too close to a massive, unseen engine. My ears popped, as if from a sudden change in pressure. Then my vision began to swim. The air directly ahead of me, right over the spot where the trail ended, seemed to shimmer, like heat haze on a summer road. But the air was cold, carrying the chill of the deep shade and the running water below. The edges of the bridge, the distant trees, the very texture of the wood under my feet. It all seemed to momentarily lose its focus, wavering as if I were looking at a reflection in disturbed water. I stopped, planting my feet, shaking my head to clear it. I blamed it on vertigo, a trick of the height, and the hypnotic pattern of the railroad ties. I took one more step, bringing me to the edge of the last footprint. The thrumming intensified, and a wave of intense, unnatural cold washed over me. It was a deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. My breath plumed in front of my face. Goosebumps erupted on my arms. The shimmering in the air grew more pronounced, and for a terrifying second, the world through that distortion seemed different. The colors of the forest on the far side of the gorge were subtly wrong. The greens too vibrant, the shadows too deep. It was as if I were looking through a flawed piece of glass into another world, one that was an imperfect copy of our own. A feeling of profound and irrational dread seized me. It was a primal fear, the kind an animal feels when it senses a predator it cannot see. My ingrained comfort with solitude evaporated, replaced by the crushing certainty that I was not alone. There was a presence here, something ancient and vast and utterly indifferent to me. It wasn't malicious, not in a way I could understand. It was simply other. I felt a strange, disorienting sense of temporal displacement, as if I were a single note held too long. A moment stretched into an eternity. The thought, nonsensical and terrifying, flashed through my mind. This place eats time. I backed away. Slowly, deliberately, one step at a time, my eyes locked on the shimmering patch of air. I didn't turn my back on it until my feet were firmly on the mossy ground of the gorge's edge. I stumbled back several yards and leaned against a hemlock, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was breathing heavily, my body trembling from the cold and the adrenaline. I checked my instruments. My compass needle spun uselessly for a moment before settling on north. My GPS was searching for a signal, which wasn't unusual in these deep gorges, but it felt ominous now. I looked at the photos on my digital camera. The footprints were there, clear and sharp, but the shots I had taken looking across the bridge showed nothing unusual, no shimmer, no distortion. My rational mind scrambled for purchase, hallucination. Sensory deprivation and isolation could do strange things to the brain. I had been alone for 5 days, pushing myself physically. Maybe my mind had simply created a phantom to explain the impossible. It was a plausible theory, one that I desperately wanted to believe. But as I sat there, trying to calm my racing pulse, a fragment of forgotten history surfaced in my memory. It was from an old book I'd read years ago, while researching the area, a 1797 account by the naturalist Benjamin Smith Barton. He wrote of the Cherokee legends of the people who inhabited these mountains before them. A strange, pale race they called the moon-eyed people, because their eyes were sensitive to the sun and they could only see well at night. The legends claimed the Cherokee had fought a great battle with them and expelled them from the region. But other versions of the story were vaguer, saying the moon-eyed people had simply vanished. I had dismissed it as fascinating folklore at the time, another local legend, like the Wampus Cat or the Mothman. But now, sitting in the oppressive silence of this forgotten gorge, the story took on a chilling new resonance. A people who couldn't bear the daylight. A people who vanished. I looked at the bridge, a stark, black line drawn across the landscape. A path that led halfway to nowhere. I decided against pushing onward. Instead, I would make camp here, a safe distance from the bridge, and observe. As dusk began to settle, draping the mountains in shades of purple and gray, the forest came alive with its usual chorus of insects and night birds. But tonight, every sound felt freighted with meaning. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. The familiar wilderness now felt alien and menacing. I built a small, smokeless fire, more for the comfort of its light than for warmth, and sat with my back against a solid wall of rock. My gaze remained fixed on the bridge, a skeletal silhouette against the darkening sky, waiting for the full moon to rise, and wondering what might come out when it did. Night fell like a shroud over the gorge. The moon, a day past full, rose above the sharp silhouette of the eastern ridge, bathing the landscape in a sterile, silver light. My small fire was a lonely spark of orange against the overwhelming dark. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the undergrowth, sent a jolt through my system. The familiar sounds of the Appalachian night. usually a comfort, now seemed like a language I couldn't understand, full of whispers and warnings. My training as a ranger, my years of cultivating a deep, seated calm in the face of isolation, felt like a thin veneer over a much more primal fear. I was an intruder here, and I was beginning to understand that the wilderness was not just indifferent to my presence. It was actively hostile. My gaze was fixed on the bridge. In the moonlight, it looked even more skeletal, a ribcage of ancient, creosoted timbers picked clean by time. And at its center, exactly where the footprints had vanished, the air began to shimmer again. It was more pronounced now, less like heat haze, and more like a tear in the fabric of the night. A wound in the world through which the cold moonlight seemed to bend and distort. The low thrumming returned, a vibration that resonated deep in my chest, a audible frequency that felt like the world's lowest note being played on some colossal, unseen instrument. I raised my binoculars, my hands unsteady. The shimmering patch of air was no longer just a visual distortion. Through the lenses, I could see things moving within it. Not clearly, but as fleeting, translucent shapes, like faulty projections on a screen of smoke. They were figures, I thought, tall and gaunt, moving with a jerky, unnatural rhythm. They seemed to be working, engaged in some frantic, silent labor upon the bridge that wasn't there. Then came the sounds. At first, it was faint, carried on the wind, the distant, metallic clang of a hammer on steel. Then, the unmistakable, rhythmic chuffing of a steam engine. A sound that had not been heard in these mountains for nearly a century. It grew louder, closer, accompanied by the screech of wheels on rails and the sharp, piercing blast of a locomotive's whistle. My rational mind screamed at me, auditory hallucination, the product of isolation, stress, and the power of suggestion in a place steeped in history. But the sounds were too real, too layered. I could hear the shouts of men, their voices thin and reedy, lost in the cacophony of the phantom industry. I could almost smell the coal smoke and hot metal. A ghost of the Little River lumber company's brutal assault on this wilderness. The logging camps of that era were notoriously dangerous places. Men were maimed and killed with terrifying regularity, crushed by falling trees, mangled in the gears of steam, powered skidders, or lost in the frequent, deadly railroad accidents. This bridge, a monument to that ambition, must have claimed its share of lives. Was this what I was witnessing? A replay of some long-forgotten tragedy, trapped in a loop by the strange properties of this place. A localized temporal anomaly, as the physicists might call it. A place where time itself was broken. The shimmering intensified, and the figures within it became marginally clearer. They were not just loggers. Among the spectral forms of men in overalls and heavy boots, I saw others. They were smaller, paler. Their movements furtive and strange. They seemed to be fleeing from the industrial phantoms, their forms dissolving and reforming in the distorted air. The moon-eyed people. The Cherokee legend had said they were driven from these mountains, expelled by the Cherokee themselves. But what if that wasn't the whole story? What if they had simply retreated into a place the Cherokee could not follow? a place between places. The legend claimed a Cherokee had attacked them on a night of the full moon because their sensitive eyes couldn't bear the bright light. And here I was, under a brilliant moon, watching their ghostly forms flicker in and out of existence. The thought that had chilled me earlier returned with the force of a physical blow. This place eats time. It didn't just record it. It consumed it, trapping echoes of the past. The loggers, the moon-eyed people, the hiker who had left his footprints. In this one, terrible spot. Suddenly, the cacophony of the phantom train ceased. The silence that fell was absolute and profound, more complete than any natural quiet I had ever experienced. The shimmering on the bridge pulsed once, violently, and then stabilized, a placid, wavering window in the center of the span. The thrumming in my chest subsided. For a long moment, nothing happened. The gorge was still, holding its breath. Then, from the heart of the shimmer, a single figure emerged. It was not a ghost. It was solid, three-dimensional, and it stepped out of the distortion and onto the solid timbers of the bridge. It was small and slender, wrapped in what looked like dark, heavy furs, its face obscured by a deep hood. It stood perfectly still at the exact midpoint of the bridge, the place where the hiker's footprints had ended. It turned its head slowly, scanning the darkness on my side of the gorge. Even from this distance, I felt its gaze lock onto my position. The primal fear I'd felt before was nothing compared to the pure, undiluted terror that now flooded my veins. This was not a replay of the past. This was the present. The presence I had felt was no longer just a feeling. It was here. I was frozen, unable to move. My binoculars pressed so hard against my face they hurt. The figure took a step toward me. Then another. It moved with a silent, fluid grace that was utterly inhuman. It crossed the invisible line where the hiker's journey had ended and kept coming. I lowered the binoculars, my breath catching in my throat. My mind, desperately clinging to the training and discipline of my profession, screamed at me to document. I fumbled for my camera, my fingers numb and clumsy. I raised it, zoomed the lens, and tried to focus on the approaching figure. But the image in the viewfinder was a blur, a smear of darkness against the moonlit bridge. My hands were shaking too violently. The figure stopped again, now only 100 feet away. It slowly raised a hand and pushed back its hood. The face was bone, white, with a flat, broad nose and a lipless slit of a mouth. But the eyes were what broke me. They were huge, perfectly round, and they glowed with a soft, milky luminescence of their own, like two full moons in the pale landscape of its face. They were the eyes of a creature that had never seen the sun, and they were fixed directly on me. The moon-eyed man. He was real. A sound escaped my lips, a choked gasp. The creature's head tilted, as if in curiosity. It had heard me. That single, small sound shattered my paralysis. I scrambled backward, away from the firelight, crab walking over roots and rocks, my pack digging into my spine. I didn't take my eyes off the figure on the bridge. It remained motionless, watching me, its luminous eyes burning holes in the darkness. I reached the tree line and forced myself to my feet. turning and plunging into the rhododendron. Hell, I had fought my way through that afternoon. Branches whipped at my face, snagged my clothes. I didn't care. I ran blindly, fueled by a terror so profound it was a physical force. A pressure from behind pushing me onward. The only thought in my head was to put distance between myself and that bridge. Between myself and those glowing, moon-like eyes. I didn't stop until my lungs were burning and my legs gave out. I collapsed at the base of an ancient oak, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. The sounds of the forest had returned, but now they were just sounds. The oppressive, intelligent silence of the gorge was gone. I was alone again, but I knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that I was being hunted. The mystery of the footprints was solved. They didn't stop. They were taken. And now, the thing that had taken the hiker knew I was here. I had looked into its world, and it had looked back into mine. As the first hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, I forced myself to move. There would be no more observation, no more reports. There was only survival. I had to get back to the ranger station, back to the world of rules and reasons. But as I shouldered my pack and began the grueling 5-day trek back, a new, horrifying thought took root in my mind. The footprints only ever went halfway across. It was a one-way trip. And I had just seen what was waiting on the other side. The 5-day hike back to my station was a descent into a private hell. The wilderness that had been my sanctuary for 2 decades, transformed into a place of profound menace. Every rustle of leaves was the footfall of something silent and pale. Every snap of a twig was the breaking of a bone. The familiar, imposing mountains no longer felt ancient and serene. They felt remote, untamed, and actively hostile. I moved with a frantic, desperate energy, fueled by adrenaline, and a terror so deep it felt like a physical illness. I barely slept, jolting awake at every nocturnal sound. The image of those luminous, moon-like eyes burned onto the inside of my eyelids. I ate cold rations on the move, too terrified to stop and build a fire, convinced its light would be a beacon in the oppressive dark. My professional training, my ingrained discipline, was a thin shield against the primal fear that had taken root in my soul. I was no longer a steward of this land. I was prey. When I finally stumbled out of the tree line and saw the familiar gravel road leading to the ranger station, I nearly collapsed with relief. I was gaunt, filthy. My face and arms a crotchet of scratches from my flight through the rhododendron hells. My supervisor, a man named Henderson who had known me for 15 years, took one look at my wild-eyed, haunted expression and his face clouded with concern. "Elias, what in God's name happened to you?" I tried to explain. I sat in the sterile quiet of the debriefing room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and I tried to put the impossible into words. I started with the facts, the things that could be entered into an official report. The discovery of an unmapped, early 20th century timber trestle bridge. The single set of footprints. The lack of any evidence of a fall or a return journey. Henderson listened patiently, nodding, his pen scratching against the official incident form. This was all within the realm of the explainable, if unusual. A missing hiker, a tragic accident in a remote sector. But then I faltered. How could I report a shimmering distortion in the air? A phantom train. A creature with glowing eyes that stepped out of a tear in reality. The words died in my throat. I saw the look on Henderson's face. A mixture of professional concern and a dawning, clinical assessment of my mental state. I knew what he was thinking: isolation, exhaustion, hallucination. The well-documented psychological toll of a life spent too long alone in the deep woods. So I censored myself. I edited my own reality. I mentioned a feeling of unease, possible auditory and visual distortions due to fatigue, and concluded that the subject of the footprints was likely deceased. Cause unknown. Search of the immediate area inconclusive. I filed a report that was technically true, but a profound lie. Henderson accepted it, but his gaze was still troubled. He recommended, strongly, that I take my accumulated leave. All of it. Get some rest, Elias, he said, his voice gentle. Get your feet back on solid ground. The other rangers were kind, but there was a new distance in their eyes. The story, in its sanitized, officially palatable form, had made the rounds. I was no longer Elias Thorne, the steady, unflappable backcountry veteran. I was the man who'd gotten spooked by shadows, the one who'd spent a few too many nights alone. My isolation, once a professional asset, had become a mark of instability. I retreated to my personal cabin, a small, rustic structure on the park's periphery that had always been my refuge. But there was no peace to be found. The woods surrounding my home were no longer a comfort. I spent my days in a fever of research, poring over old logging company maps, historical archives, and obscure folklore collections. I reread Benjamin Smith Barton's account of the moon-eyed people, his words now feeling less like folklore and more like a field report. I searched for any mention of my bridge, any record of a logging camp accident so horrific it might have torn a hole in the world. I found nothing. The bridge, and the thing that inhabited it, remained an anomaly, a data point that fit no known pattern. My nights were sleepless, filled with a gnawing dread. I'd sit in the dark, a shotgun across my lap, listening to the sounds of the forest, trying to distinguish the natural from the unnatural. I was caught in a liminal space of my own, trapped between the rational world I had always known and the impossible truth I had witnessed. My mind felt like that shimmering air on the bridge, a place where two realities bled into one another, creating a constant, nauseating distortion. Weeks turned into a month. The sharp edges of my terror began to dull, replaced by a heavy, bone-deep exhaustion. I started to tell myself that Henderson was right. It had been a hallucination, a waking nightmare born of solitude and stress, a hiccup in my perception of time and space, as one psychology book I read put it. I began to sleep again, in short, fitful bursts. I started to believe I might be able to reclaim my life, to file the memory of the bridge away as a traumatic, but ultimately unreal event. Then came last night. I was sitting in my armchair, reading a book. The silence of the cabin broken, only by the whisper of turning pages and the low hum of the refrigerator. It was a normal sound, a comforting sound. But then another sound began to bleed through it, a low, sub-audible thrumming. I froze, the book falling from my hands. It was the sound from the bridge, the vibration I had felt in my bones, the one that signaled the thinning of the world. It was faint, distant, but it was unmistakably here. My heart hammered against my ribs. I told myself it was the refrigerator, a truck on the distant highway, my own overstrained imagination. But the thrumming grew, a steady, resonant pulse that seemed to come from the very air around me. A floorboard on the front porch creaked. My blood ran cold. I was paralyzed, every muscle locked in a rictus of pure terror. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the crushing silence that followed. Nothing. Maybe it was a deer, a raccoon, a branch falling. My rational mind, my ranger's mind, offered up a dozen plausible explanations. But they were all lies. Slowly, my body trembling, I forced myself to stand. I crept to the window that overlooked the porch, my hand shaking so badly I could barely part the curtains. I peered out into the inky, moonless dark. At first, I saw nothing but the familiar shapes of the trees, black against a starless sky. Then I saw them. 2 points of soft, milky light, floating in the darkness, just beyond the porch railing. They were perfectly round, and they glowed with their own internal, malevolent luminescence. They were not reflecting light. They were the source of it. It had followed me. It had crossed the bridge. It had crossed the 5 days of wilderness. It had found my home. The boundary wasn't the bridge. The boundary was me. The eyes blinked, once, slowly. And as I stood there, trapped in their gaze, a single, horrifying thought crystallized in my mind, clear and cold as the grave. The footprints only ever went halfway across, because that was the price of admission. You give it your path, and in return, it takes yours. And now, it had come to collect.